Hey everybody, Anthony here. To start, I really wanted to focus on mindfulness in the beginning so I could dedicate more time at the end to really do a deep dive on Roy Bradbury's The Veldt and the social implications it has with today's society. So to start with the mindfulness, it was actually one small portion on page 17 where Kabat-Zinn writes that mindfulness is what arises when you pay attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally as if your life depended on it. This really hit home for me because in my job as a recovery support specialist at a mental health and substance abuse facility, I constantly find myself in this position where I'm like a middleman between the client and the counselor. I work second shift, so we don't have any clinicians on site to help clients process really emotionally heavy and draining things, and we have a lot of those in the human services field. So a lot of the times, these clients come to me late at night and they want to vent and they want to talk about these sensitive, heavy things. And while I'm not a clinician, I do have some clinical training that I've picked up from school, some from the supervision I get towards my licenses every week. There's some techniques that I've learned about, like assuming a relaxed posture, focusing on the client, that really help to ensure that I'm in the moment with the client. When the client begins expressing themselves to me and telling me what they're feeling and what they're going through, I'm not thinking about how that relates to my background processes. I'm not thinking about what the client thinks of me while they're telling me these things. My background chatter begins to dissipate and I become fully in the moment with the client. I inhabit another domain of mind where I'm simply with them. The background noise is stopped. I'm not thinking about, oh, do they have a disorder? Is something deeper going on here? I'm just listening to them and how it relates to what they're going through right now. So it was really interesting to realize that, wow, already I'm incorporating mindfulness techniques into my daily work. I'd love to be able to take a step back and see if I can incorporate this into my own life. And when I'm fishing, can I make it just about the fact that I'm there in nature with a line in the water? So moving on to The Veldt, which I loved, it absolutely blew me away. Roy Bradbury's The Veldt was published in the 50s. And something that really stood out to me early on in the story was George says something to the tune of, "You're never too young to think about death." This is right after he realizes that his kids are spending a lot of time in this African veldt with these lions that are clearly tearing something apart. He can't tell, but he knows that there's some death going on here, and that the kids are kind of fantasizing about death a little bit here. Um, Him and his wife are kind of going back and forth about how this house has kind of started to replace their duties as parents and as individuals, about how all this technology is really stripping them of their humanity in a way. And it's implied early here that they're also wondering, how is this affecting our children? This was powerful to me because at a young age I dealt with a lot of death and grief as well, and I had a hard time processing it. And for a long time, I considered a lot of that grief and death as being a contributor to some of the struggles I had growing up. The irony here is that I actually had human beings who helped me, understand death and process it. Whereas here in the Veldt, it's this nursery, this aptly named nursery, that's raising the children and helping them explore death and experiment with death. It's really interesting to consider the way that can skew our divination, the way it can make things seem less real. Like what at this point I begin to wonder what is death exactly to the children, Peter and Wendy. What is death to them? We get to explore that later, and I think this has some serious power when we compare it to some of the things talked about in How to Read Literature Like a Professor. There were two chapters in particular that I was really torn between when it came to starting this discussion, and it was it's gonna hurt more than it's gonna hurt you concerning violence, and it's all political. These two really play into each other here because I think the violence that we see later in the story is kind of the pinnacle of the political aspects of this story. When we take a step back and we think about the time that the Veldt was written and published. It was the 50s. It was right after World War II. We had seen all sort of man-made horrors employed in that war, some seriously grisly stuff. So I think that a lot of Bradbury's writing here, it's still raw, it's still fresh. We're still at this era where we're seeing like this mass industrialization go through, and TVs and radios are becoming more household commodities. Just a few years later, we have our first color TV in '54. I think there's a lot of awe and wonder about technology at this point, and it clearly manifests itself in the Veldt, where Bradbury's not just writing about the dangers of technology, right? He's also writing about what happens when our children grow to depend on this technology. And this has a lot of implications regarding the way we're raising children right now. I mean, we have kids who are computer literate by the time they're 6 or 7 years old. I mean, my 4-year-old sister can search things on Google and utilize the tablet to find videos she likes on YouTube. It's all innocent, sure, but how far are we really from the Veldt, right? It's on page 123 that not Bradbury, but Foster writes that knowing a little something about the social and political milieu out of which a writer creates can only help us understand her work, not because that milieu controls her thinking, but because that this is a world she engages in when she sits down. Bradbury's engaging with a world that is rapidly evolving, that is rapidly becoming more technologically advanced. So I think a lot of his fears and concerns are manifested here. Now, the irony is that this isn't just about technology being dangerous and raising our children. The violence aspects aren't about technology making us violent. No, the violence in the Veldt isn't about the violence. It isn't about George and Lydia being killed in the nursery. It's not the nursery that kills them. The act of violence utilized in the Veldt is actually George and Lydia being consumed in the Veldt by the lions. And Foster writes on page 103 that the answers regarding the use of violence in a story may have to do with psychological dilemmas, spiritual crises, and historical or political concerns. I think the concern here isn't necessarily that technology is going to make children more violent, but it's that technology is going to consume the presence of the parents in the children's lives, that the nursery, our smartphones, our computers, our YouTube educational videos are going to eventually take a more foreboding presence over that of our families and our parents' lives. So when we think about it that way, again, the violence wasn't about George and Lydia being killed. Bradbury could have done a number of things to have them killed off. The kids could have been fantasizing about World War II. That would have been really fitting for Bradbury's time. But instead, no, he chose the African Veldt. He chose a natural and primitive kind of area where instead they're being consumed. And I think that's really brilliant. It kind of dawned on me while I went back and flicked through some pages of how to read literature like a professor, because it dawned on me like, oh, wow, no, this wasn't just about technology making kids violent. It wasn't ever about that. It's about technology consuming us. It's about us becoming more reliant on technology and less human. It's about being raised by our smartphones, so to speak. To finish this up, I know I've run a lot of it over, but I want to end by posing the question to you guys who plan on having kids or already have kids. What will you do to balance society's rising dependence on technology with the need for a present and affectionate parent? Thanks. Have a good night.